"I'm just a mailman," Robert Wilson said quietly as he sat across from Elvis Presley in the small Memphis diner, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. For 30 years he'd walked the same route, delivered mail to the same houses, watched children grow up and families change. In 2 years he'd retire, and Robert was terrified that his life had meant nothing more than delivering bills and birthday cards to people who barely knew his name. What Robert didn't realize was that Elvis had been quietly investigating his route for weeks, and what the king discovered about this humble postal worker would shock an entire neighborhood. But to understand how Elvis Presley became fascinated with a mailman's daily routine, we need to go back to April 1976, when Elvis decided to rent a modest house in the Magnolia Heights neighborhood while working on new material away from the distractions of Graceland. Elvis had chosen the quiet residential area specifically because it felt like real America, tree-lined streets where working families lived, children played in front yards, and neighbors actually knew each other's names. He wanted to write songs about authentic experiences, and he figured the best way to understand regular people's lives was to live among them, even if temporarily. On his third morning in the house, Elvis was sitting on his front porch with his guitar when he noticed something remarkable happening on Maple Street. At exactly 8:30 a.m., a mail truck pulled up, and a man in his late 50s stepped out with the kind of purposeful energy that spoke of decades of routine. But this wasn't just any postal worker making deliveries. This was something entirely different. "Good morning, Mr. Robert," called a voice from across the street. Then another, "Morning, Robert," and another, "Hey there, Mr. Wilson." Elvis watched as the mailman, Robert, apparently, waved to each person with genuine warmth, stopping to pet a dog, calling out to children getting ready for school, and taking a moment to chat with an elderly woman who had come out to water her plants. Over the next week, Elvis found himself timing his morning coffee to coincide with Robert's route. What he observed was unlike anything he'd seen in his years of fame and celebrity. Here was a man who wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't trying to impress or entertain, but who somehow managed to brighten every single person's day just by showing up and being genuinely interested in their lives. Elvis began to pay closer attention. Robert didn't just deliver mail, he delivered connection. He knew which houses had new babies and would linger to ask how the parents were sleeping. He knew which families were struggling and would take extra time to chat, somehow always managing to lift spirits with a kind word or a shared joke. Most remarkably, Robert seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the neighborhood's rhythms. He knew Mrs. Patterson hadn't been getting her usual correspondence from her son, and would gently ask if everything was okay. He noticed when the Johnsons' teenage daughter seemed upset, and would find a reason to mention something encouraging about her college applications. He was aware that the Martinezes were behind on their mortgage, and would somehow manage to slip information about community resources into casual conversation. But it was Robert's interaction with 8-year-old Timothy Chen that really caught Elvis's attention. The boy had been waiting by the mailbox every day for a week, clearly expecting something important that wasn't arriving. Instead of just moving on, Robert sat down on the curb with Timothy and explained how mail sometimes took longer than expected, especially when it was coming from somewhere special. "You know what I do when I'm waiting for something really important?" Robert asked the boy. "I write a letter to someone else who might be waiting for mail. That way the postal service stays busy making people happy while we wait for our special delivery." Timothy's face lit up with understanding, and the next day Elvis watched as the boy handed Robert a carefully written letter to his grandmother. Robert treated that letter like it was the most important piece of mail he'd ever handled, promising to make sure it got delivered with extra care. That evening, Elvis found himself walking past the neighborhood post office just as Robert was finishing his shift. On impulse, he struck up a conversation. "Excuse me," Elvis said, approaching Robert's mail truck. "I'm new to the neighborhood, and I couldn't help but notice how much everyone seems to love their mailman." Robert looked up, surprised to see a stranger taking interest in his work. "Oh well, I've been on this route for 30 years. You get to know people when you see them every day." 30 years? That's incredible. You must have seen a lot of changes." Robert's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm people get when talking about something they genuinely care about. "Oh my. Yes, I've watched babies grow up and go to college, seen families move in and out, been through good times and hard times with all of them. The Hendersons lost their eldest son in Vietnam, and I was there when they got the telegram. The Williams had twins after trying for years, and I got to deliver the birth announcements. Mrs. Patterson's husband died last year, and now I make sure to take a few extra minutes with her, because I know Tuesdays are hardest. That's when she used to bake his favorite pie." Elvis was struck by the genuine emotion in Robert's voice. This wasn't small talk. This was a man describing his life's work with the kind of passion most people reserved for discussing their children or their deepest beliefs. That sounds like more than just delivering mail, Elvis observed. Robert looked slightly embarrassed. Oh, I don't do anything special. I pay attention, I guess. These are good people, and sometimes good people need someone to notice when they're having a hard time. Over the next few weeks, Elvis made it his mission to understand Robert's route. He would take morning walks, timing them to intersect with the mail delivery, and what he discovered was extraordinary. Robert had created an invisible network of care and support that operated through the seemingly simple act of mail delivery. He knew which elderly residents might need someone to check on them if they didn't come to the mailbox for a few days. He was aware of which families were going through financial difficulties and would somehow connect them with neighbors who had extra work or resources to share.